The FBI and DEA have raided the Texas state office. The notorious Narco Queen was caught with 2.8 tons of fentanyl, with assistance from the U.S. military.
$14 million in drug proceeds, 96 firearms, 40,000 rounds of ammunition, and 5:14 in the morning. Those four numbers were enough to upend the image of an agency once seen as a symbol of order and legality in the state of Texas. It did not happen in a rundown neighborhood, at a border hotspot, or in the middle of a desert. It happened inside the headquarters of a state agency, where every seal and every signature had long been viewed as the official truth for millions of residents and businesses. Under the cold fluorescent lights of the marble hallway, at a moment when most people in Texas were still asleep, heavy footsteps echoed in perfect order. There were no alarms, there were no shouts, there was no chaos. There was only the precise movement of a team that already knew who they needed to find and what they needed to secure. At exactly 5:14 in the morning, federal agents entered the Texas Secretary of State's office, the agency responsible for storing and certifying some of the most sensitive records in the state, from business registrations and administrative data to documents tied directly to the election process. Their target was not a street dealer. It was Ethan Mallory, the Texas Secretary of State, a man who had once overseen the lawful flow of paperwork, procedures, and official recognition. To the public, his name was linked to legitimacy and institutional stability. But after two quick strikes of a pry bar against the wooden door, that image collapsed. Under an ordinary-looking desk, agents found concealed packages of fentanyl and methamphetamine hidden inside secret compartments. Next to them were semi-automatic firearms tucked behind stacks of state-sealed documents. In a place meant to serve as a frontline defense against crime, crime had taken a seat at the center. Corruption did not have to break in from the outside, because it had already taken root inside the structure. And when Ethan Mallory was led away in silence, the person in handcuffs was not the only thing being removed. The very idea of trust, held by millions of people who relied on the system, was being shaken. If everything had ended at the office in downtown Austin, the situation might have been dismissed as a personal downfall. But when federal teams entered Mallory's suburban home, the true nature of the case began to surface. The neighborhood streets curved past lawns trimmed evenly, clean white fences, family cars parked neatly by the porch, and the distant sound of barking dogs. There was nothing to suggest any link to the criminal underworld. But behind the locked basement door, the reality was very different. 96 firearms were lined along cold concrete walls, next to metal containers holding more than 40,000 rounds of ammunition. Nearby was a large quantity of narcotics with an estimated value of $14 million, packaged carefully like a shipment waiting to move. This was not the trace of random crime. It showed every sign of a distribution point inside an organized network. A former investigator who once handled major drug cases admitted that, in the past, seizing a few pounds of methamphetamine was considered significant. What agents found in this home went far beyond that. It suggested that this was no longer about one individual. It was a link inside a system operating at a much broader level. What unsettled the agents the most was not the weapons or the drug money. It was the normal life just above the basement. For years, neighbors had greeted the man every morning without knowing that only a few steps away, a piece of a deadly trafficking machine was quietly running beneath their feet. When data from the electronic devices in the home was extracted and decoded, one name kept appearing inside the encrypted communication network: Martha Alicia Mendoza Aguilar. Inside federal files, she was not listed by her real name, but by a nickname that made even experienced personnel approach with caution: La Diabla. For years, that alias appeared scattered through reports linked to organized border crossings, underground networks, and hard-to-trace transport routes. She existed in the files like a blurred puzzle piece. Everyone knew the name, but almost no one knew the life behind it. Investigators found that La Diabla was not hiding in violent regions as many had believed. She lived in Texas with lawful documents, attended fundraising events, signed local contracts, and stood beside her husband at official gatherings. Not every powerful woman in the criminal underworld flaunts luxury or intimidation. La Diabla represented another model, one built on silence, discipline, and complete reliance on legitimacy. She operated through schedules, paperwork, invoices, and connections inside formal institutions. Within that structure, Ethan Mallory was not a fighter. He was a gatekeeper. Each signature he issued and each seal from his office had become a passport for a cross-border trafficking network that did not need force to move forward. Paperwork was the first shield, marriage was the second, and the institution he represented was the strongest cover for a system built to harm the same communities that supported it. By that point, agents understood they were not dealing with a couple committing crimes, but with a model engineered to survive inside the very system created to stop it. What was found at the Austin office and the suburban home no longer allowed federal agencies to treat this as an isolated matter or as a simple case of an official who lost his way. Every number, every file, and every device pointed to the same conclusion. Behind this couple was a structure far larger, broader, and more deeply embedded than anyone had imagined. The arrest in Austin did not close a story. It ignited a chain reaction that began spreading across the state of Texas. That same night, at a mobile command center set up beside the DEA field office in San Antonio, the large screens lit up in the dark. Data from dozens of sources, including financial activity, transport logs, cargo schedules, and encrypted communications, began stacking into a complex network map that no one had ever been able to see in full until that moment. At the center of the display stood one name: Operation Iron Veil Phase 3. 6 counties, 4 critical transit points, and 1 objective. The goal was to shut down the system before it could adjust itself and erase its own trail. In operations like this, time was not only important, it was a matter of survival. The longer it dragged on, the more chances the network had to delete records, reroute shipments, and build a new layer of cover. The more agencies involved, the higher the risk of a leak. So the decision was made quietly, without advance notice, without press, and without any public announcement. As the city rested in silence before dawn, helicopters lifted off the ground and armored convoys split in multiple directions, rolling down empty highways. No sirens, no flashing lights, only the quiet movement of another machine beginning to turn. The first strike targeted a warehouse in El Paso that, on paper, was registered as a storage site for agricultural supplies. From the outside, everything looked normal. Neatly stacked fertilizer bags, gardening tools hanging from racks, and a few trucks parked under pale streetlights. But to those who had spent months tracing every fragment of data, this was no ordinary warehouse. It was one of the main arteries in a hidden distribution system, where legal and illegal goods exchanged places under the same set of labels. When the metal door was breached, the calm space erupted into a mix of echoes, dust, and the sting of cold steel. Inside, a group of people was already in position, wearing body armor and carrying weapons, moving with the discipline of individuals who had prepared for this moment for a very long time. The confrontation was brief but intense. Shell casings struck the concrete. Sparks flashed from metal shelves. A forklift tipped sideways across a narrow aisle. One agent was hit in the shoulder, pulled out, and treated on the spot, while the rest of the formation held their ground. There was no panic. There was no hesitation. Both sides seemed to understand this was not a routine raid. It was the collision point of 2 machines that had quietly built themselves for this moment. When the noise finally settled, what lay behind the camouflaged cargo was the true target of the operation. A fleet of long-haul trucks had been rebuilt with false walls, lead-lined compartments, and protective layers designed to defeat routine inspections. These were not vehicles for small-scale trafficking. They were the infrastructure of an industrial transport system, where a single trip could carry enough product to endanger an entire community in a short amount of time. Those trucks were not just vehicles. They were proof that this network had invested in engineering, design, and durability, the same way a legitimate corporation builds its supply chain. While one part of the task force handled the scene in El Paso, another strike unfolded at the same time in Laredo, at a transfer yard known as Riverstone Freight. On paper, it was an ordinary transport company with lawful contracts, complete inspection records, and valid operating permits. There was no gunfight, no chaos, only workers standing still, avoiding eye contact, as agents stepped into the small office in the back. Inside, the items seized were not weapons or obvious narcotics. They were operational notebooks, disposable phones, envelopes covered in coded notes, and electronic spreadsheets listing shipments that stretched across more than 30 states. Each line of data marked a route, each number marked a destination. Each schedule was part of a distribution network so organized that no legitimate carrier would deny its technical perfection. In the next 72 hours, names began entering the arrest roster at a pace investigators had never seen before. More than 800 individuals were detained for questioning or prosecution, including not only those directly involved in trafficking but also way station attendants, freight brokers, a deputy sheriff, and even a municipal medical examiner. People entrusted with enforcing order, recording facts, and safeguarding administrative integrity now appeared in the same files as the individuals they were paid to stop. What truly unsettled investigators was not the number of arrests, it was the perfection of the facade. Every warehouse had clean paperwork. Every truck had valid certification. Every shipment had a verified recipient. There were no signs of the usual disorder found in small-scale criminal groups. The system operated with the precision of an efficient administrative body. At a glance, it looked like the flawless routine of a government doing its job. And that was where a darker truth began to emerge. Many of the individuals involved never believed they were helping a cartel. They thought they were assisting an important client, handling a time-sensitive request, or making a one-time exception to keep operations running smoothly. But when those exceptions repeat often enough, and long enough, they stop being exceptions. They become the new boundary of a distorted order. where wrongdoing no longer takes the shape of guns, but the shape of a seal, a signature, and a data file saved without anyone asking questions. What unfolded in the first 72 hours was only the visible surface of a deeper structure, where violence, money, and power did not operate the way movies often portray. Instead, they functioned like a standardized, measured, and optimized process developed over years. As analysts began connecting all the data from Austin, El Paso, and Laredo, they no longer saw scattered points. They saw a complete diagram, the blueprint of a nationwide logistics network designed intentionally and adjusted over time to adapt to every small change in its environment. They gave it the name the two-way wheel, not because of its shape, but because of the way it spun in both directions. It pushed toxic product north and pulled financial strength and violent influence back south, forming a nearly closed loop. In the northbound direction, fentanyl and methamphetamine were produced in industrial-scale labs across the border, no longer makeshift spaces as many still imagined. They were controlled facilities with organization, division of roles, quality checks, and planned distribution. The products were packaged inside shipments that looked harmless, labeled as consumer components, packaged food, or industrial materials. These were items that moved across federal highways every day without triggering suspicion. Those shipments did not sneak through the dark. They blended into the massive commercial flow of the modern economy, moving among millions of other containers, thousands of companies, and countless routes managed by computer systems. Every shipment carried a handwritten code, but it was not an improvised marker or a casual habit. It was an internal identification system that linked each load to a specific route, a specific group of intermediaries, and a projected profit margin. It resembled the way multinational corporations track their supply chains, except the purpose here was not to serve a market. It was to poison the communities along those routes. This was not the language of the street or impulsive crime. It was the language of management, risk modeling, resource allocation, and efficiency. In the opposite direction of the wheel, weapons, mechanical parts, and tactical equipment were purchased lawfully inside the United States through legitimate businesses. They came from sporting goods stores, licensed dealers, parts suppliers, and larger auction platforms. Each item, on its own, carried no sign of wrongdoing. They were simply products manufactured, sold, and transported under lawful procedures. But when assembled, sorted, and redistributed through a chain of programmed decisions, they became the backbone of violent conflicts unfolding hundreds or even thousands of miles away. The trucks that carried those shipments did not display gang symbols, they did not use threatening imagery, and they did not challenge the law. They carried company logos, valid license plates, updated inspection records, and delivery contracts signed by legally registered entities. Many had even been hired for projects involving local government. Legally, there was no immediate point of suspicion. Morally, and in terms of consequences, they were pipelines carrying a toxic lifeblood across the same nation that produced them. What truly unsettled investigators was not only the scale, but the system's ability to protect and rebuild itself. Every main route had at least 2 fallback routes. Every front company had an alternate version ready to activate if the current identity was questioned. Almost no one knew the entire structure. Each individual saw only a narrow slice, enough to finish their task, but not enough to realize what they were supporting. A warehouse worker saw only boxes to arrange. A waystation employee saw only a truck exceeding a few numbers on a digital screen. A clerk saw only a request with a familiar seal. To them, everything fell within the normal range of daily duties. The problem was this: that very sense of normalcy, repeated thousands of times by thousands of people, had become the mechanism that kept this machine running more smoothly than any criminal organization of the past. Higher up were the brokers, people who never appeared in confrontations and were never found at the scenes, but who were present at every critical decision. They understood the law well enough to avoid violating it in ways that would draw immediate scrutiny. They held networks of relationships where businesses, government offices, and semi-public institutions overlapped. They knew who to call, who to send documents to, and when a small exception could become an accepted precedent without further questions. At the top, La Diabla did not wield power through threats or open violence. She used soft power, built on the image of a successful, lawful woman with social standing. She understood that in the modern world, the most convincing weapon was not the gun. It was the acceptance granted by a system designed to decide who is trustworthy and who is not. Once that system recognized you, the rest became technical details. From that perspective, Ethan Mallory was not a traditional mastermind. He was the bridge. One signature from him could turn a shipment into a priority load. One seal from him could grant a temporary exemption to an entire route. One administrative decision that looked harmless could shift hundreds of checkpoints without anyone raising a concern. When administrative power connected directly to underground power, a network built to evade the law began functioning inside the shell of the law itself. When the full system map appeared on the command center wall, the feeling was not triumph. It was the heavy silence of people who had just seen something that should never have existed. The question was no longer how many people were involved. It became how many gaps had existed all along without anyone truly looking into them. If a few small exceptions in routine paperwork could create a nationwide network, then the stability people believed in might have been resting on a far more fragile foundation. As information slowly spread, the official response followed a predictable pattern. Emergency meetings were held, reform pledges were issued, public statements promised greater transparency and stronger oversight, advisory groups were formed, procedures were reviewed on paper, new regulations were drafted with stricter language. But outside those closed conference rooms, in ordinary communities filled with people who had no power to rewrite laws but lived with the consequences, a different reaction took shape, quieter but far heavier. In a small town hall, rows of plastic chairs sat neatly beneath fluorescent lights. Faces looked tired. There were no protest banners and no shouted slogans. Neighbors simply looked at one another in silence, as if they had all discovered that the home they trusted had a secret door they never knew existed. An older man who had worked in local administration for more than 30 years stood to speak in a slow, steady voice. He was not angry. He asked a simple question. If everything was properly documented and every seal followed procedure, then what had truly gone wrong? No one answered him. In another town, a young mother who had lost her child to a fentanyl overdose looked toward the government building and said she had always taught her children to believe in the law, to trust the people behind the desks, and to believe those people were there to protect the community. Now she was no longer sure what she could teach her surviving child. For her, the wound did not come from the traffickers themselves. It came from the fact that those individuals had entered her life through the most lawful path possible. From that moment on, the question was no longer part of a criminal case. It became a question for society itself. If a machine could run so smoothly that even the gears inside believed they were doing the right thing, then what responsibility did individuals have when facing such smoothness? We are taught to respect procedure, trust the system, and follow the rules. But is that still the right path when those very procedures have been redirected toward a different purpose? The greatest threat was not loud, violent, or chaotic. It was quiet, reasonable, documented, and backed by data and official seals. It did not break down the door. It was invited in. It did not disrupt order. It wore the appearance of order. And while people kept looking toward the border and toward threats from the outside, right in the center of the room, that wheel continued to turn, not through violence, but through the trust people had placed in it from the beginning. When every map had been assembled, when the numbers settled on the reports, and when the names appeared in the files, the feeling that remained was not the closure of a case. It was the empty space left by an unanswered question, because this was never just the story of La Diabla or Ethan Mallory. It was the story of a system that allowed power and routine to replace responsibility, a system that allowed convenience to become more important than vigilance, and allowed small exceptions to repeat long enough to become a new norm that no one dared to name. For many years, people were taught that order was built by rules, and that as long as procedures were clear and paperwork was correct, things would move in the right direction. But what had just been revealed told a different story. Any system without honest oversight could be steered toward a purpose it was never meant to serve. And when that happened, the greatest danger did not come from the person in the shadows. It came from the fact that no one was looking closely at the true nature of the light. Some people had stepped forward, raids had taken place, names had been exposed, reforms had been promised, but no statute was strong enough to replace the vigilance of a society. No committee had enough authority to do the work of millions of eyes and millions of questions, because once trust was given without conditions, it could become the perfect shield for wrongdoing. This story did not ask you to become an investigator or to stand on the front lines with a map in hand. It offered a simpler choice, though a far more difficult one. It asked you to look more closely at the things we still call normal, to look at the seals, the signatures, and the procedures that seem emotionless, and to ask again who benefits from this perfect operation, and who is truly paying the cost. Empires do not collapse in noise. They fall in silence, in the small decisions repeated long enough that no one notices they are wrong anymore. And if you believe truth still matters, if you believe responsibility does not belong only to a handful of officials but to every person living inside the same system, then the only thing that can keep this wheel from turning further off course is your awareness. Hold on to it, because sometimes the greatest danger is not the darkness, but an order that looks too perfect to question.